Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And it's always a pleasure to be here to talk about the presidents. And today's topic will be, as you see there, Mr. Calvin Coolidge tipping his cap to us. It's a very fine photo. He did love his hats. That was one of his luxuries in a very frugal life. But we'll learn about his life, his political career, his family, and his political belief systems. And we'll also look into some of the legacy that continues today. In fact, I'd just like to start out by saying there's a very interesting and relevant article about Calvin Coolidge in a very recent copy of the Washington Post. It's dated August 16th. It's written by former Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels, and it's shining a little light onto the legacy of Calvin, which we'll cover today. So we begin in the state of Vermont at the Coolidge Homestead in Plymouth Notch. You see an outline of the state of Vermont. The location of Plymouth Notch would be south central as you look at the state to your left. This is a family homestead that has remained protected by the state at first, and I believe now it's a National Heritage Site. This is the place where many generations of Coolidges lived before him. But prior to that, the Coolidge family had settled in Massachusetts. So we'll see a return to Massachusetts by Calvin a little bit later in his life. But this is where he was born, 1872, on July 4th. I believe he's the only president to be born on the 4th of July. And now we will see a picture of his dad, his name, just like Calvin, John Calvin Coolidge. Most people do not know his first name was John, but like his dad, he was named John Calvin Coolidge. There's a long line of Calvin Coolidges in the Coolidge line. They were either named John Calvin or Calvin John or Calvin with a different middle name, but many, many Calvins go back in this family tree, all named in the memory of religious leader John Calvin. This is a picture of his dad, who was a very prominent local politician, ombudsman. He was a justice of the peace. He was a sheriff. He pretty much covered all the local bases. He was also a member of the state legislature in Vermont. So Cal, from a very young age, was exposed to the political system at a very local level. He was often with his dad at the town hall political meetings, and he also accompanied Dad to Montpelier, where the capital was located, and he attended many, many sessions of the Vermont legislature. So young Calvin was truly immersed in politics from a very young age, and his belief in politics always stemmed from the fundamental belief in the local view over the national view. His upbringing in Vermont, going to the town meetings, gave him a belief in a real raw democracy, a real fundamental democracy that never left him. And his dad also is well known for being the only father to administer the oath of inauguration to his son becoming president. And we'll see a painting of this a little bit later in our slide presentation. John, in 1868, at the age of 23, married a woman by the name of Josephine Moore. There are no surviving photos of her that I know of. Calvin revered his mom, and when she passed away when Calvin was 13, he kept a small photo of her in his locket around his neck for the rest of his life. So Calvin certainly suffered from the loss of his mom, and then he lost his sister a little bit later, his younger sister Abigail. So sadness tinged the life of the Coolidges for sure, but young Calvin was a hardworking kid. His dad never made rules for Calvin, and this was the way that John was raised. John Sr. was raised, and his father raised him. And the reason he said there were no rules for Calvin, it's because young boys will only break rules. So by having a no rule system, Calvin was left on his own to judge right from wrong. And he did pretty well at this. He was not a very brilliant student. He was a dedicated student, and again had a lively interest in local politics, starting from right around this picture where he was just a young toddler. The next photo we'll see comes from his teenage years when he was a student at the Black River Academy in Ludlow, Vermont. Again, teenage Calvin, uh, growing in stature. He was a very slight child. He's starting to fill out somewhat, and he's also starting to fill out his mental capacities with increased performance in his studies. He's putting more effort into it. He's succeeding more, and he's starting to see a bit of a broader picture of the world outside of his small town in Vermont. There is a quote I'd like to read right now, and this comes from a little later in his life, but it reflects on his childhood. And this is a quote from his autobiography, which I'll try to quote from frequently today. I do enjoy reading some of these early thoughts from Calvin. Quote, country life does not always have breadth, but it has depth. It is neither artificial or superficial, but it is kept close to the realities, end quote. So this is the Calvin that is formulating his ideas and grows into a skilled politician in the years to come. The next slide, we'll see a picture of the Black River Academy in Ludlow, still standing, no longer in use as an active school, but it is a national historic site or possibly a state historic site. I'm not exactly sure, but it is protected and you can visit it. It's now a museum. It's lovely grounds. And again, this was a school that his dad attended as well. So there is some family history there as well. We move along now to the next slide of his continuing education. This is Calvin at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts. I believe the picture on the left is a little bit later in his career when he's posing with some Amherst football players. But on the right is a photo of him as a dapper college student, again, showing his love for hats. And this is where he really comes into his own as a public speaker. He comes into his own as a bit of a comedian. We see a sharpening sense of humor. He's known for a very, very dry sense of humor, like, unbelievably dry to the point where you're not really sure if he's trying to be funny or not. But when you read his quotes and you look at his kind of bemused expressions in some of the photographs, you do realize this was a man with a sense of humor, despite what some of the historical accounts may say. Very, very fine-tuned sense of humor. So we see a very, very strong growth period here at college for Calvin. His studies become more intensified, and he rises to the challenge, finishing with honors in his graduating class. And we also want to point to one of his mentors at Amherst. The next photo will show his philosophy professor, Charles Garman. This man was very influential in the sense of connecting Calvin to connecting the future Calvin to the childhood Calvin, meaning that Garman's philosophy, very religious based, very much a philanthropic mentality. Giving back to the community is more important than taking from the community. So this is a strong influence that stuck with Calvin the rest of his life, for sure. He always cited Garman as a major influence in his ethos for public service. And we think the message landed very successfully. We move on now to a photo of his next stage of life. This is as a young lawyer in Northampton, Massachusetts. He begins reading law with an established firm, and then shortly thereafter borrows money to start up his own firm. He's generally considered a successful and sharp lawyer who mostly takes on business clients. And the house on the left is a house that he rented uh, shortly into his law career after he meets and marries the love of his life, who we'll meet next. But this is a house that still stands in Northampton and is also a protected site. And we see him on the front porch there in his rocking chair, probably hiding the cigar that he likely was smoking out there, because he refused to be photographed smoking cigars, which was one of his true joys. So we move ahead to the connection between young Calvin on the left and Grace Goodhue on the right. The lovely Grace was a Vermont native. She was a graduate of the University of Vermont in the early 1900s. I believe she's the first lady to graduate from a four-year college with a full degree. And she went on to move to Northampton, Massachusetts, to teach at a school for the deaf. So that was her vocation. She was an instructor for deaf students, and this is where she met Calvin, who happened to live across the street. And there's a story from the Coolidge family about their first encounter, and not sure on the veracity of the story, but it is a good one. It's a story of Grace looking out of the window across the street and seeing young Calvin shaving into a mirror with a hat on the back of his head, holding his hair away from his head so he can shave. And he's in his underwear, his long underwear, with a hat on. And she apparently thought this was very funny, unintentionally funny, of course, and sent a pot with a flower in it across the street via a third party to just let him know that she was there across the street. And this begins a friendship, which begins a relationship, which begins a marriage, and a very successful one at that. And by successful, I simply mean that despite their vast differences in personalities, meaning that Calvin, of course, later known as Silent Cal, a man of relatively few words, very shy, very reticent in social settings, which I can relate to. He has this quote from his autobiography about being a young kid and walking downstairs to meet somebody in the family house that his dad wanted him to meet. And the feeling of walking through a door where strangers awaited him was always a feeling of fear and trepidation. And it's no wonder that he ends up gravitating towards Grace, who is a social butterfly. She's gracious and amiable and fully comfortable in any setting. So the connection here really is significant for Calvin, in that as a politician, he now has a partner who is a buffer, who is the front person for this partnership. He can remain in the backdrop, kind of behind the scenes, not being required to participate as much in the social events. So their partnership really, really did work. And as Calvin put it, we thought we were made for each other. For almost a quarter century, she has borne my infirmities, and I have rejoiced in her graces. Grace, end quote. So there we have the Coolidges, and now we go on to meet, well, this is the house we saw just a bit ago. This is on Massasoit Street in Northampton, Massachusetts. It is preserved and visitable today as a historic site. They rented this house for, I think, about 20 years, from the early 1900s till right up around his presidency or his vice presidency. So this is very much connected to the Coolidge family in that way. And we'll go on to see the two sons in the next slide who were raised in this house. We see on the left Calvin Jr. looking much like his dad Calvin, and we see the older son John and mom Grace there in a very uncomfortable photo. I'm not sure if they're scowling as much as just really not into it. I'm sure there are more pleasant photos of the Coolidge family. In fact, I know there are. I've seen them, but this is one of them. And I believe the next photo shows the sons also, as we go to the next one. And it does. And this is when they're a little bit younger, but this is likely, I want to say, about 1915. This is probably when he was lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. after his mayoral position in Northampton. And I like this photo. It's kind of informal and a bit strange, but his career begins to really take off as his lawyer practice grows. He becomes the mayor of Northampton. He becomes a Republican Party operative, dedicated to the party, but not a party loyalist to the point of extremism. He's more of a middle of the roader when it comes to these things. He's certainly not considered a progressive Republican. At the same time, he's in favor of fair labor practices. He's in favor of women's suffrage. So there are categories where he kind of defies classification. He does cross over and offers some appeal to, for example, Irish Democrats in Massachusetts. So his successful political career starts to grow here in this town in Northampton, again with the mayorship. Then he becomes a state representative. Then he moves on, and I think the next picture we'll see him as a state representative, if I'm not mistaken. This should be about 1908. Yeah, this is a little bit before the last picture, but it does show you as he starts out his legislative career. And then he goes on to become the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, as we go to the next photo. And he is elected along with this Republican, Governor Samuel McCall. They were elected together on basically the same ticket, 3 consecutive terms. This is 1915 to about 1918, I believe. I think they're just 1-year terms at the time in Massachusetts. And McCall is also considered mildly progressive in some of his actions. And I think the Coolidge-McCall team worked quite well. I believe Coolidge learned a lot about legislative techniques from McCall. And the other personally interesting thing about Governor Samuel McCall is he is the grandfather of one of Oregon's more famous governors, Tom McCall, governor here back in the 1970s, and very much considered a progressive of his era. So we see the McCall legacy begin here. And there's a very interesting State of the State address by Governor McCall from about the year 1917, which got my attention as far as his leadership goes. And so we move along now. The Coolidge-McCall team is also partially backed and funded by this man, Frank Stearns. He is the son of a successful Boston merchant who takes over and expands the business and becomes a political operative, much in the style of a Mark Hanna, who was McKinley's handler. This guy was the behind-the-scenes person who put Coolidge on a national map in 1919 by publishing speeches of Governor Coolidge's remarks and consolidating them into a pamphlet, which was produced at the 1920 Republican Convention, which basically gave Coolidge a more national stage. So Stearns is your behind-the-scenes operator for the rest of the Coolidge years. And we move along now to, I believe this is the McCall Coolidge ticket for Massachusetts. 3 times these Republicans won, and all 3 times Coolidge outpolled his governor. So that means Coolidge had more crossover appeal to the Democrats than McCall did. And this shows up right on through the rest of his career as governor and as president. We move forward now, and this will be the governorship, I believe. Oh, no, this is still when he's the lieutenant governor. Oh, this is the new one that got added. This is a very a funny little headline. Mrs. Coolidge may not cook, but she plays with her boy. Well, this is a good time to throw in a brief story about Coolidge's sense of humor. And again, the more I read about Coolidge, the more I realized he's kind of like the Bob Newhart of presidents in his delivery and his style. But here's a story that I can't verify, but I found fascinating and very funny. This was probably around the same time when he was lieutenant governor. The family was having a party, and Mrs. Coolidge was showing off her newfound pie crust recipe and baked some apple pie for the guests. And the pie got served around, and the guests, in their politest manner, tried to ignore the fact that the crust was basically inedible. So they're choking down the pie, and no one says a word until Calvin pipes up and he says, "Oh, and did you hear Grace got a contract with the road department for the recipe for the crust?" And people, they didn't laugh. They just stood there and said, "Oh my gosh, did he just say that?" But he did, and it was his gentle, not very kind way of commenting on her cooking skills. So this headline does kind of tie into that. And we move forward to his governorship, I believe. This would be a 1919 victory. And it's at the same time in Massachusetts and across the country, we see growing unrest amongst the laboring classes. We see a rise in general strikes across the board. And in Boston, 1919 saw a very, very widespread police strike, which got increasingly out of hand. Rioting started to take place. The mayor of Boston called in Coolidge to send in help. Coolidge at first resisted and eventually did decide to send in the state militia with the now legendary quote, "There is no right to strike against public safety anywhere, anytime, or any place," end quote. This is the pinnacle of his governorship. This quote gets widely played nationally. He's seen as a firm and decisive leader, stepping in against the strikers. He's praised across the board. Democrats, Republicans alike send out messages of support in his stepping in to restore public order in Massachusetts, primarily in Boston. And it's considered a success story. And this is the quote that spurs Frank Stearns on to publish the pamphlet that gets distributed in 1920 at the Republican convention. So now Coolidge is a national figure, and we move forward. This is his hands-on dealing with the militia arriving in Boston in 1919. Again, his actions, whether they came late or whether they came right on time, were widely seen as exactly what was needed to quell the upset. Moving forward, we see Coolidge's name thrown into the mix as a vice presidential candidate after Harding is chosen in the 1920 Republican convention. Coolidge is a compromise candidate who comes in a little bit after several more known figures have rejected the offer of vice president. So Coolidge gets involved in a national political race for the first time, and he's paired with Harding. And this is a very, very important connection with Harding, because there's an underlying kind of balance here. Many times we see the presidential tickets in this era and before being balanced geographically. This is more of a temperamental balance. I believe Coolidge was chosen at least in part because of the oppositeness he was to the Warren Harding persona. And it wasn't just appearance and superficial. They were deeply different Republicans. And I think that was the intent of including Coolidge in the mix. And as it turns out, with Harding's death, which we'll see next, coming up in August of 1923, 100 years ago, which we learned some about last time, this thrusts Calvin Coolidge into the presidency. And again, the choice of the vice president in 1920 becomes very critical at this point, because by 1923, it's becoming known the depths of the corruption that has corroded the Harding administration. This is just starting to become well known. The Teapot Dome scandals and the Veterans Bureau scandals are rising in public attention. There's demands for hearings, and Harding certainly would have been included in the investigation, possibly would have been the first president to get a mugshot. had he survived. But by dying and thrusting Coolidge into the leadership position, it really does, in a way, clean the slate for the Republican Party, because this is very, very similar to Gerald Ford taking over for Richard Nixon. Circumstances, however, are far, far different. You know, the hand-picked successor who pardons the outgoing president, not exactly the same here. However, it's the similarity to Ford, in my opinion, is the stability factor that comes in with Coolidge. Coolidge is literally the perfect man for the job at this time, in his restraint, in his just determined forcefulness without show to root out the corrupt people in the government and to proceed forward as smoothly as possible. And we'll go ahead and we'll see the next slide. This is the inauguration that I mentioned briefly earlier. There are no photographs. This happened at 2:47 a.m. on August 3rd, 1923 in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Calvin was visiting family. Word came in through a messenger because there were no telephones hooked up to this house. There were no electrical wires at all. So the message came in person. And the inauguration also happened immediately, as per the recommendation of Secretary of State Charles Hughes. And the father is, as a notary public, able to do it. So this happens with witnesses at 2:47 a.m. And then Coolidge, who came down from his bed wearing his suit, went back to bed, took off his suit, and went back to sleep. And that's the quiet inauguration of Calvin Coolidge. Now, there is also a story of a second inauguration that happened quietly back in D.C. when he returned to the Capitol. And this was not revealed for almost 10 years afterwards. And the reason a second inauguration was done with more formal attention is they wanted to make sure there were no questions about this particular inauguration. They didn't want to have it questioned, so they just did a second one as a backup, and then it was confirmed. I think after Coolidge died, that was confirmed that had happened. At any rate, Coolidge's first job is to deal with the scandals left behind by the Harding administration, and the continuing Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, is probably the number one thorn in the side of Coolidge, in the sense that he's squarely involved in these investigations, and yet he's still acting as a functional Attorney General. Coolidge was okay with that at the beginning, simply because he didn't want to upset any transitional differences between administrations. He preferred to keep on the Harding people as much as he could, but increasingly Daugherty became a liability, and Coolidge did ask and receive his resignation not too long into the finishing of Harding's term. So that was the first step of distancing himself from the administration that had the office prior to him. And also, he had Senate allies who were following up on Teapot Dome, on the Veterans Bureau scandal. So the general view of the public was that Coolidge was on the job, taking care of business, and took the penalties, or took the indiscretion seriously from the Harding administration, and was detached enough from them that he did not have any taint on him. So he was able to proceed forward. And we'll continue with, I believe, this is a reenactment of the inauguration. Yes, this is what they do up in Plymouth Notch. They're so proud of their native son that they put on this reenactment of the midnight or the overnight inaugural. And we'll move along to the next person. This is Judson Weller. He was referred to as a literary clerk. He was hired by Harding while Coolidge was still vice president. And when Coolidge became the president, he kept Welliver on as an assistant for speechwriting purposes. He's considered the original presidential speechwriter, and thus the presidential speechwriters have the Judson Weller Society in honor of this pioneer of putting words in presidents' mouths. I seem to think, though, that Weller was an assistant as opposed to the writer himself, because Coolidge was an effective writer and less so as a speaker, but it was mostly his words that I think do come through most of his speeches. It's hard to imagine Coolidge reading a script, in other words, like they do today. So I think it was a little different than today's presidential speech writing, but still you see the origins of the style beginning here. And the next person we must talk about is the person who became his press secretary as soon as he took over in the White House. This is C. Bascom Slemp. That should be an A instead of a U. But Campbell Bascom Slemp is considered the first modern press secretary, dealing with the new forms of radio and film, in addition with the print media. He was kind of the what would you say? He was the front man for fielding questions and such. Although Coolidge held his own press conferences, it wasn't quite like you see today. Slemp was kind of the coordinator and access person for seeing the president. But what's controversial about this man is he was a congressman from Virginia before he became this press secretary. And in 1922, just a year before Coolidge took over as president, Mr. Slemp, as the congressman from Virginia, voted against the 1922 Dyer anti-lynching bill. He wasn't the only person to vote against it, but he was the only person to vote against it to receive a paid position in the White House in the Coolidge years. So immediately upon his appointment, the black press jumped on this as a sign of Coolidge caving to the Klan and Coolidge pandering for white supremacist votes. And this may have truth to it. There's no evidence Coolidge was a racist himself by any means. He was opposed to obviously things like lynching. Didn't come out strongly as president against that, but he did support the anti-lynching bill as vice president. So his choice of Slemp was questionable at best. And there's also the connection between Slemp and his father, a Confederate general. So there were concerns that this was a choice that was done for vote gaining purposes and not for integrity purposes. But Slemp did not stay on all that long. He was replaced by a man named Everett Sanders, far less controversial, and really with no history of any kind of anti-lynching sentiments or anti-lynching sentiments. So we move forward to the next slide, and it's going to be an informal, it's a posed photo, but it's an informal look at the Coolidges using a relatively modern form of communication, the telephone. By the 1920s, telephones were quite commonplace. And at the same time, his own dad didn't have one up at Plymouth Notch. But I like this photo just because you see both of them smiling together, however posed it was. They do show kind of an intimate connection. What's interesting about their marriage, though, is that as smart as Grace was and as involved as she was in many things, as the First Lady, she was involved in White House renovations. She was involved, just like her predecessor, Florence Harding, in prevention of cruelty to animals. She had many, many pets at the White House, including a pair of raccoons that got some national attention. But she wasn't a confidant as Florence was to Warren. She wasn't an influencer directly in politics as Florence was. She was very much behind the scenes, but was so well liked because of her natural easygoingness that even Alice Roosevelt, who pretty much mocked everybody during this era, including Calvin, she said Calvin looked like he was weaned on a pickle. But to Grace, she wrote, nothing but nice things. Her unaffectedness, her just natural, easygoing niceness. She was truly a wonderful hostess and enjoyed her role in that position. And going forward, we see on the next slide, we're going to also see what Coolidge was able to do with the media. He interestingly, he presents this image of being uncomfortable, of being pinch-faced and kind of grumpy. And there's pictures of him holding kids where the kid's crying, and Coolidge looks like he wants to cry. But to me, the more photos I looked at, the more I realized how good he was at cultivating the media to present him in a favorable light. This is really what he was doing. This is a photo that was taken out west, a stage shot. I believe this is in South Dakota during his second term. But again, he managed to treat the press with respect. He gave over 500 press conferences, 2 per week. He gave over 50 major radio addresses. So he was not only using the media in its infancy, for example, the radio, he was using it as a message purveyor, but he was also making sure the people behind the cameras and behind the pens were taken care of and were felt like they were part of the inside loop. And I believe he was very successful at cultivating a favorable media and press attention. And moving ahead, we are coming across another photo shot. This is from 1924. And this actually, the photo on the left, I believe, is directly connected to a very significant event of the first Coolidge term in June of 1924. Coolidge officially signs a bill making all Native Americans official United States citizens, which seems like it was only about 300 years too late, but it still came in the form of Coolidge signing a bill. And interestingly, Coolidge, despite these silly outfits he's wearing, which kind of make him look, like a panderer, he actually had a small amount of Native American blood in him. And I think that always did factor into his decisions regarding natives. Pretty good record overall, considering the era regarding Native Americans. Moving forward, we come across a much sadder story, and this is the loss of Calvin Coolidge Jr., who died at age 16 after coming up with a blister on his foot while playing tennis without socks on. The blister led to septemia, which killed him in only a short time. He was 16 years old. He died in July of 1924. So this is right as the 1924 campaign for presidency is kicking into high gear. And it was a very short illness and very sudden. And this threw Calvin for a major loop. There have been books written on the evident clinical depression that Calvin fell into after the death of his son Calvin. He was closer to Calvin than he was to John because he felt more of a kindred spirit in Calvin, not only with the same name, but he kind of looked more like his dad. And he really took the loss very, 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 very difficultly. And as a result, we see some friends and some physicians trying to step in to help. And the next slide, I believe we will see one of his newfound pastimes after this period. Yes, indeed, he becomes an avid fisherman, but it's not without some caveats. He basically won't touch bait, so Secret Service men are baiting his hook for him. He really doesn't know anything about fishing except he enjoyed catching fish. So there are many photos of him dressed up like he's going to church or a business meeting, but no, he's going to the lake to pull in some walleye or whatever he was fishing for there. But again, this was a solace thing. This was a way to get his mind off of his late son and just to relax, because he really had no hobbies. When someone asked him once what his hobby was, he said holding office, which, in between times, when you're not actually at work, it's nice to have something else to fall back on. physically, the only thing he was known to do was to walk and ride a mechanical horse at the White House. And other than that, not much into physical work or play, even other than rocking on his rocking horse, smoking a cigar. Here you see a cartoon of him fishing, and there were many mocking type stories of him uh, maybe missing the point of why he was fishing. But again, it did capture the national attention for a while that he, finally found something to do outside of holding office. We move forward to a baseball game, June 18th, 1925. Here he is shaking hands with Washington Senator, Hall of Fame pitcher Walter Johnson. And most interestingly here was that Calvin Coolidge was not the baseball fan of the family, because that would have been a pastime. It was his wife, Grace, who was the baseball fan. Not only the baseball fan in the family, she was the baseball fan of Washington, D.C. She was so into baseball, and she couldn't really explain it, but she was so into it that the American League, for a several decade period post Coolidge presidency, would mail her a free pass to any American League baseball game for that season. Every year she would get a gold kind of a trimmed envelope with a all-in pass to any game in the American League, which I thought was kind of cool. So Calvin was known to go to games and show very little interest, occasionally napping. And his wife actually said during one entire 9-inning game for 2.5 hours, his only words were, "What time is it?" So there you go, the enthusiastic sportsman Calvin Coolidge. So we move forward, and we're going to see the vice presidential candidate for 1924. Remember, Coolidge had no vice president in 23 and 24 because he had been one and moved up to the presidency on the death of Harding. So to fill the vacancy, the Republican Party chooses Charles G. Dawes, VP candidate. Now, I'm going to spend a little time on this guy because he fascinates me beyond most people of this era. So let's start. He was born in Ohio, based in Illinois, spent some time in Nebraska. He was a lawyer, a businessman, a banker, and a financier. He got his start in politics by managing William McKinley's 1896 campaign and was rewarded with a job in the Treasury Department. During World War I, he was a brigadier general and in charge of procurement for the entire military. And during a post-World War I Senate hearing on military expenditures, when he's being asked and nitpicked about tiny numbers, for example, how many plates they bought or forks or whatever, he got really upset and he had an outburst that became legendary. He shouted out, "Helen Maria, we weren't trying to keep a set of books. We were trying to win the war." And he became known as Helen Maria. Now, it's always written as Hell and Maria, but he insisted, he said Helen Maria, the name Helen, because that was a saying when he lived in Nebraska, and it was a nice way to swear without swearing. And that was his story behind Helen Maria. But he became known as Helen Maria Dawes. He goes on to become the first Bureau of the Budget Director under Harding. And after that, during the Coolidge half of the Harding presidency in 1924, he's appointed to the chairmanship of a commission on German reparations. So this is a board deciding how to rebuild Germany, how to direct private loans, government loans, and such. So he's coordinating the rebuilding of Germany, and it's a idea known as the Dawes Plan, for which he receives the Nobel Peace Prize. So he becomes the only vice president with a Nobel Peace Prize in his bag. And even more amazing about this man, who's friends with John Pershing, which certainly helped his military career. They went way back to Nebraska. He was friends with William Jennings Bryan, who was from an opposite party and had way different philosophical and political beliefs, but they became friendly as well. But more amazingly is that he was a self-taught musician. And in 1912, he wrote a piece called Melody in A Major, which became a small success amongst composers of the era. A few folks recorded that as recording came on in the later part of the teens and 20s. And it kind of remained in the backdrop. This was a song that they would play at events for him when he would show up. So he was associated with the song he had written. And we all know this song today because in 1951, it was given lyrics by a man named Carl Sigman. And in 1958, it became a #1 hit on the Billboard charts. I can't remember the artist's name offhand who got the hit. But 1958, the song It's All in the Game became a #1 hit, thus putting Charles G. Dawes, 1924 vice president from 1925 to 1929, just putting him in a very unique category. He and only one other man have a #1 pop hit on the Billboard charts and a Nobel Peace Prize. The other man, Bob Dylan. So there you go. Charles Dawes and Bob Dylan side by side in a very unique category. So there you go. And again, going on to his vice presidential career, which was generally nondescript, he goes on to really just anger Coolidge on day one of his vice presidency by going into the Senate and giving a speech blasting filibustering, blasting the concept of filibustering, and naming names of senators, mostly from the South, who couldn't stop Tommy Edwards, very good, couldn't stop filibustering. So he was actually exposing this practice as being misused. It's a misinterpretation of Article 12. Like, he had all the details down of why filibustering needed to stop. He was kind of filibustering about the filibuster. And Coolidge is like, you can't go in there and piss off the Senate on day one. You know, that's not helping. So they had an early rift. This picture may have been taken like before he went to the Senate that day, because I don't think there were too many friendly pictures of these two guys together. And sure enough, in 1929, after Coolidge had decided not to run again, in 27, he chose to back out of the 28 race. Hoover gets the nomination. But Dawes was the guy who was going to get the VP nod there. He was going to continue on in his vice presidential position. Coolidge said, no way. That guy is not going to be VP because that's an insult to me. And the Republican Party had to come up with a new candidate who will meet next month when we meet Herbert Hoover. So moving forward now from the amazing Charles Dawes to the campaign bling. Dawes was the front guy during the campaign. He was doing most of the speaking, most of the heavy work, most of the traveling. Coolidge did some, but mostly was, as president, was being presidential and, staying close to the White House. But again, it was a fairly successful economy going at this time. Coolidge had already begun his attempts to lower costs in government. That was basically his #1 goal as president, was to be a cost cutter, to cut government debt and to eliminate burdens for future generations. And he was extremely successful at this, by the way. His overall record by the end of his term in 29 was a $7 billion cut in the budget, which was about 1/3 of the total budget at that time. So a success story that showed in the 1924 results. So we move forward in 24, and we will see more bling. This was the beginning of the keep cool era. You see a lot of the cool references with the fan, and then you see the photos down below. They were really using this jazz era term freely with the name Coolidge, and it just seemed to flow. And he was a cool-tempered person. Some called him frigid even, but it seemed to work. 24, we saw a lot of economic successes, so the country was just riding the wave, and Coolidge was looking pretty strong here, even in the early primaries. Coolidge seemed to, he wasn't going to be challenged in this upcoming election, but we'll see the challengers next. we come up to the next slide, and it is Fighting Bob. Wow, there's some great photos of Robert La Follette from Wisconsin. He was a true progressive leader of a very adamant nature who broke away from the Republicans as early as 1912, was very disappointed that Teddy Roosevelt got involved in the progressive movement and just kept on going all through the teens. He was an advocate. He was a strong advocate against the First World War, and a lot of the investigations in government corruption stemmed from his office at this time. So he was a really, you can say, righteous politician, but had the public good in mind, known as Wisconsin governor for his Wisconsin plan, which very much led the way to the progressive movements of the Roosevelts that came later. The Wisconsin model probably is the first government model that has government experts being hired to deal with state problems. He was very much into education and women's suffrage, certainly ahead of his time, and decided to throw his hat in the 24 race. He ends up winning only his home state of Wisconsin and their 13 electoral votes. The rest of the votes go to the next man we'll see, John W. Davis. He was a politician from West Virginia. Just give you a couple of little tidbits about John. It took 17 days at the Democratic Convention and 103 ballots to come up with this guy who was neutral on the Klan. You didn't really know where he stood on the Klan, and that's why they picked him, because you had two guys going at each other, Al Smith versus William McAdoo. Al Smith against the Klan, William McAdoo for the Klan. They had to pick someone out of that fight, and they compromised with John W. Davis. Certainly an able lawyer, congressman, diplomat. He had been the ambassador to Great Britain. Or I'm sorry, no, he becomes the ambassador to Great Britain under the Hoover administration. That's right. No, I'm sorry. No, he was the ambassador to Great Britain. I'm a little confused. There's so many ambassadors to Great Britain in this story that I have to really backtrack a bit. We have three of them in the story, and we'll meet one of them coming up. But the man we just met, Charles Dawes, was named ambassador to Britain in 1929. Davis had already been ambassador to Britain under Woodrow Wilson. So, because he was a Democrat, and he was also a Wilson advisor at the Versailles Treaty Conference. His running mate is William Jennings Bryan's brother, Charles Bryan, who I had never heard of until researching this story, Nebraska governor. And they put up a pretty good ticket, and yet only win a handful of southern states. It's a electoral, and it's a voting landslide for Coolidge in the 24 election. So we'll go on to the next slide, and we will see Frank B. Kellogg, Secretary of State. This is the third in the series of Great Britain ambassadors. He's a Minnesotan, but of New York birth, another lawyer. He was a special government counsel in the Standard Oil cases. He was elected to the Senate in 1916 from Minnesota, and he's most known for, during the Coolidge years as Secretary of State, most known for the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was an agreement with France, and the crux of the agreement was to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. This was a non-binding agreement. This had no real lasting impact other than symbolic on the world. And yet, Frank B. Kellogg named Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1929 for this pact. So again, it's symbolic. It's a step in a peaceful direction, and at the same time, doesn't really stay in effect very long. But this is what, and he does look like Anthony Fauci. Wow, that's very true, Michelle. Good call there. So we move along, and we go from Kellogg to, where are we going next? The inauguration. The second inauguration, is that right? Second term, right. The second inauguration is on your left. This is a much more obviously traditional March 1925 inauguration. Uh, Again, I'd like to read a small tidbit from his inaugural speech that day in 1925. Quote, "The fundamental precept of liberty is toleration. We cannot permit any inquisition, either within or without the law, or apply any religious test to the holding of office. The mind of America must be forever free." End quote. I like that quote. That's a very nice quote. And he also is known for such quotes as, "I am for economy, and after that, I am for more economy." To back this up, I mentioned his reducing the deficit very successfully, but more practically speaking, he was known as one pencil Calvin to many government workers who were only issued one pencil until they can prove that it was no longer useful. And this is just a small example of how his mentality worked as far as being a chief administrator. He was more of an administrator than an executive in many ways. But again, there are signs of his expanding the federal government during his presidency, which we don't really pay much attention to. He's often seen as a laissez-faire, hands-off, old-school Republican, let business leaders take care of everything, and it'll all come out right. And at the same time, under his watch, we see things like the FCC under the name the Federal Radio Act. We see aviation being controlled under federal law. So we do see steps towards the federalization that we have today in many areas during this second term of Coolidge. Moving ahead now, we'll see a cabinet photo of this. We believe it's of the second term. We see Hoover up there just above to Coolidge's left. And the other big player here is Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of Treasury, who stays on through this entire period, the originator of the trickle-down economic theory, which, again, showed a lot of flaws towards the end of the 20s. We had the strong stock market going through the 20s. We had a hands-off government letting stocks do their thing. But this was this was Coolidge's belief in many, many areas, the hands-off approach. So we see this in the stock market, and we see it backfire. We also see his hands-off approach with regards to federally controlling the agriculture sector. There was a bill came up twice during his presidency. It was called the McNary-Haugen bill, and it was introduced by two Republicans to alleviate farmers who were undergoing hardships from drought, from other weather conditions. And he vetoed both bills because he didn't believe the federal government should be involved in agricultural subsidies. This is the very end of the era where agriculture was completely on its own. Because shortly thereafter, with Hoover a little bit, and then with FDR heavily, we see full government involvement in purchasing surplus and selling it, and all these things that Coolidge did not believe in. Coolidge believed in just business is business. The chief business of America is business, is one of his quotes, and he believed businesses fall and die on their own and aren't supposed to be propped up on their own. And we see this time and time again in the Coolidge years, but we also see a gradual federalizing of our country during this period. And one of the key players is Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who seems to be the impetus behind a lot of these federal programs. And it's interesting because we'll learn in our next lecture how much Hoover is blamed for inactivity when it came to federal intervention with the stock market. So we move forward, and we're going to see a lovely period magazine cover. I believe that's our next slide, the Vanity Fair cover showing on the right Calvin Coolidge, and on the left Greta Garbo. The title of this magazine cover was "The Impossible Interview," two of the least verbal of the celebrities of the era. And at the same time, Greta far exceeds Calvin in silence, because Calvin's got all sorts of good quotes and even long speeches. He can be long-winded at times. So it's weird how he got the nickname Silent Cal. It's simply that he had a style that he controlled, that seemed to, be able to express something in few words. So because he was good at that and didn't go on and on often, he seemed to be silent, but in fact, he really wasn't at all silent. So I think Garbo wins the contest here, who is more impossible of an interview. I mean, how could you beat an interview like this? You know, Calvin gives a press conference and he's asked 3 questions, and all the answers are no, no comment, and no. And then as he's walking out of the room, he says, "And don't quote me on that." You know, like, that's just, is he being funny or is he being serious? I don't know, but I think it's pretty funny. And when he's asked on his departure from the White House what his greatest accomplishment was, he said, "Minding my own business," which, again, you just got to love that. So we'll move forward now. We see his depiction in the national spotlight of Vanity Fair magazine. We also see this shot of his reactions during the Great Flood of the Mississippi River in 1927. This is a very, very controversial event in the sense of we have the beginnings of federal intervention in national calamities. We didn't really see this much before this period. The way money was raised prior to this, when there were local calamities, often was bond issues, and where citizens would be investing in the future of a certain area. I know this happened in the town I'm in right now, in Bandon, Oregon, in the 1930s, when it burned to the ground. Local banks and officers would set up bond purchasing to help rebuild the town. Well, back in this period, pre-FEMA, Calvin really he issued some tough quotes on these things, and I believe the quote there that you see on the screen is one of the quotes where it's just not the government's job to be picking people up who get knocked down by Mother Nature. And at the same time, he vetoes an early relief bill, and it was really pork barrel ridden. And then he works with Congress, and they end up coming up with a compromise measure that he does sign that does provide relief to the victims of the flood. And he uses the terms the interstate commerce, and the mails must keep going, and the flowing of our rivers and rails. So he's using international and national trade as an excuse, so to speak, to intervene. Not suffering, that wasn't an excuse, because the farmers who suffered, they got vetoed, and he was ready to veto the people also here. And there was a quote by Will Rogers, who considered Coolidge a good man and even a friend. Will Rogers had a quote is, "Boy, all this delaying, I think the politicians are just waiting for more victims to die so they don't have to pay out as much." I mean, it was a harsh but heartfelt comment by someone who was very, very increasingly impatient with federal non-response. And this is kind of the end of an era where government really fights back on these kind of relief efforts. We see shortly thereafter a change of heart and a new focus on rebuilding as being worth the money and worth the expenditures on the federal level. And we move again to another event from his second term. This coin was issued on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There's George Washington in the front of Calvin Coolidge, kind of an odd combo. But again, I've never seen this coin. I didn't know it existed, and I think it's interesting. I didn't know Coolidge had made any currency. So there he is. And he also shows up on a few stamps a little bit after his passing. But again, his legacy really is obscured. He quietly announces to not run in 1927, which opens the race up to candidates from his party, and Hoover seems like the obvious candidate. And although Coolidge wasn't really a big fan of Herbert Hoover, here's what he said about Herbert Hoover, who he called Wonder Boy. I'm not sure if that was Coolidge's own kind of sarcastic nickname, or if that was a more generally used nickname behind Hoover's back. It was not complimentary. But here's what he said about Wonder Boy. "That man has offered me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad," end quote. But he couldn't have really meant that completely, because he did trust Hoover to take over the reins as president. He endorsed his candidacy in 1928, but did not endorse his vice president, Charles Dawes. So the compromise candidate out of the Republican convention in 28, Charles Curtis, ends up getting the seat that Dawes held because Coolidge wanted it that way. Calvin did not live very long after his presidency. He went into writing columns, headed a few financial groups, and died in 1933. I believe he was 60 years old, and it was a bit of an unexpected and sudden death, which the nation did reach out and feel sympathy towards the family, including Democratic Governor Al Smith of New York, who wrote a wonderful eulogy on Calvin, talking about his public service and how Calvin put that above party, every time. Not necessarily above philosophy, but above party. And we do see the nation mourning their former leader. And we move ahead now to the final analysis. I would say that Coolidge dove into obscurity directly because of the Depression and Hoover's connection to it. He also was buried by New Deal historians who were doing the opposite of what Coolidge believed in, the hands-off, let local government take care of local problems approach. The federal interventionist style of the 30s, which some may argue was absolutely necessary to save capitalism, was definitely not Coolidge's style. He didn't approve of that large government, and would have been probably appalled had he lived through the 1930s. But we do see a revival in the Coolidge legacy the day Ronald Reagan steps into the White House in 1981. He replaces some photographs that were on the wall with one particular photograph of Calvin Coolidge, and he makes a comment about it. It's known in the press that Coolidge, he's looking up to Coolidge as somewhat of an idol, and it would probably be in the less government is better government quotation zone. Again, though, Coolidge, despite his reputation, did expand the federal government to a small level. And this includes the story of Prohibition. 1926, we were about halfway through the experiment of Prohibition, and it was seen as a widespread failure. Everyone knew where to get alcohol. The Harding administration flaunted their alcohol use, whereas Coolidge definitely did not. I'm not saying he didn't drink at all. He certainly was not known to be a teetotaler. But his use of alcohol was certainly not promoted, highlighted, laughed about, or done anything publicly about. I do not believe alcohol was served in the White House during the Coolidge years, at least officially. And in 1926, he issues an executive order mandating that local police and local sheriffs and state agencies help federal agents go after bootleggers, because what was happening is federal agents were going out to these remote districts and getting zero help. In fact, getting obstruction from local law enforcement. Local law enforcement was making more money on the bootleg market than they were in enforcement. And so Coolidge was dismayed by this and actually increased federal presence. And this is a guy who thought local was better, but he did see areas where the federal government was failing and needed help. In my opinion, this is the beginning of the anti-federal government movement in the country. It's the 1920s prohibitionists. This is when you had people like actively, angrily acting up against the government because of this law that was virtually unenforceable. So you see Coolidge kind of caught in the middle of this. But he was undoubtedly a small government guy, and he did see the flaws in local rule. Certainly, he saw the flaws of the lynching law. That's why he supported the 1922 Dyer Bill, which is the first bill I've seen from that era in particular that actually says we are introducing this bill because of the failures of the states to enforce their own law. So he understood the need for federal intervention. I think he really did, but only grudgingly and only slowly during his presidency did that become a reality. And again, I mentioned, besides the Reagan connection, I did mention the recent article by Mitch Daniels. I read it. I enjoyed it. I'm not sure about Mitch Daniels and his politics, but he makes a lot of good points. And his main point, I think, is this, that when a country needs something the most, when it's at its low point, and it needs kind of an opposite kind of feel to it, it's often when it's the least likely to happen because of the extreme need. And he brings that up with Coolidge. He says Coolidge is the type of personality we desperately need, and yet we have no chance of paying any attention to someone like Calvin Coolidge today, because we're all about the bling and the show and the dances and the touchdown celebrations and the high fives and the fake humility and all these things that go with politics and always have gone with politics. But we see time and time again in this era I've been focusing on, we see people of integrity show up, and it doesn't mean they're without flaws, but they show up and they make their presence known, and the legacy continues. And Calvin's legacy is right there for anyone to study, for anyone to research. It's very tangible. It's not that long ago, really. And there's also a documentary either being released soon or has been released about him that should bring more to the table. But mainly, I think the overlooked human side of Coolidge is really sorely in need of reviving, regardless of your political views. This was a man who really, I think he had public service figured out. It really wasn't about him. He had a very controlled ego. Not that he had no ego, but it was controlled, and he was able to win 18 of 19 elections that he entered. This is an all-time record. If it was a baseball pitcher, he would be in the Hall of Fame. He'd be next to Walter Johnson with an 18-1 record. So his success rate was very high, and it's, again, he was Republican Party, standard bearer, and at the same time he wasn't on the extreme end of it, which drew in people from the middle on both sides. He was I wouldn't call him a fence sitter as much as a moderate, cautious, middle of the road, absorb things slowly, was against rash behavior, rash movements, and it shows in his presidency. Not a dynamic president, but effective for the era. And I don't see blame being put on Coolidge and Hoover for the Depression, simply because it wasn't in our DNA yet to have the government come in and bail us out. It's in our DNA now, and that's okay. We can't judge things from 100 years ago or 200 years ago and put it into today's context very fairly or easily. But it is important to just keep the Coolidge single pencil standard in mind as we go into all these eras of extravagance. And I think we still have a lot to learn from this man from Vermont. So I'm concluding now, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to see if I can answer.
Before we do that, before we go to questions, I just want to play a snippet so that hear that? Did anybody hear that?
No sound yet.
No, you weren't hearing that song?
Nothing.
Really? Oh, that's weird. I'm playing it on my end, and I can hear it fine, but I don't know why it's not playing on your end.
Nope.
All right.
Nope.
Okay. Anyway, you could easily look up the song. It's all in the game. performed by, I wrote in the chat, Tommy Edwards. Chuck, you can unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Tommy Edwards, The Four Tops, recorded by Nat King Cole, Van Morrison, Ricky Nelson, Benny King, some rapper named Little Kiki, Barry Manilow, UB40, Merle Haggard, George Benson, Isaac Hayes, Cass Elliott, Art Garfunkel, Cliff Richard, and the list goes on and on. There's Freddie Fender, Donny Osmond and Marie Osmond, Engelbert Humperdinck, Slim Whitman, and that was the Tommy Edwards 1951 version. So just a little trivia there for you. Chuck, you need to unmute yourself because I muted you by mistake. But anyway, so I have we have time for questions, and I just want to go to questions. So if you want to unmute yourself, ask your question, raise your hand. We can go in an orderly fashion, or however you want to do it.
I have one question. How long was Harding president when he suddenly died?
He was president for 2 years and about 3 or 4 months, from March 21 to August of 1923.
Okay, and then Coolidge took over, and then he had to run again for the second term, right?
Yeah, he finished Harding's term and then ran again in 24 and concluded in March of 1929. He could have run again. There was no rule at the time against it, and he hadn't run twice himself as president. So there could have been a Coolidge movement to keep him in office in 1928. He chose to step out, though, in the year before, in 1927. He said that's too long for one person to be president. That was his opinion.
Okay, and my other question is, in the beginning you said that they rented a house for about 20 years in Vermont. I was wondering
in Massachusetts, in Northampton, Massachusetts, yes.
So I was wondering, was his family not well off that they could own a house they rented for over 20 years?
You know, that's a very good question. I wanted to bring this up and I forgot to, so you just reminded me. This is my estimation. There's no official record that I know of, but in my estimation, Calvin Coolidge was the least valuable president upon entering the White House from at least the 1900s forward. So the last 120 some odd years, no president has come into office with as little financial, backing. He was worth, on his entry into the White House, he was worth about $10,000, which is about $125,000 today. And he owned nothing. He didn't own an automobile. He didn't own a house. He never owned a house. He only rented the house in Massachusetts. Now, he inherited the house in Vermont from his dad, but I'm not sure if that ever ended up in his name or went right to some sort of like heritage thing. I don't really understand how that didn't factor in, but because his dad was alive when he became president. His dad made it to the second term, so I don't know how that transferred or if it changed his wealth status. But he was frugal, which probably allowed him to save the kinds of money he did. But when he was in politics, all those positions he held didn't pay very much. He gave up money by not practicing law to be a public servant. He absolutely lost money and didn't mind. He was okay with that. He was not about the money. It's very strange to see how little emphasis he put on that. And that goes back to his college professor, Charles Garman, and it goes back to his dad and his religious belief, which was about serving, not about getting. Not about accumulating. He didn't like the worshiping of accumulation. He thought we did that too much in this country. And I could agree with that.
Thank you, Chuck.
Mm-hmm.
Questions out there?
That picture that you showed us, the one where the four of them are very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, were they in front of a firing squad at the time, or what was it? Oh my God! I mean, if a public figure took a picture like that now, you could blackmail them. You could say, "Listen, I got a copy of this picture, and I'm going to release this to the press and ruin your career." I mean, it's amazing. I mean, all four of them. It's
all
what
four
just
of them,
happened?
Yeah.
Did someone just shoot the dog?
Who looked the angriest? I think John, the son, looked pretty angry, but they were all scowling. Yeah, that was sour.
It's like,
But
forget.
it's funny. Coolidge's image is often seen as sour, weaned on a pickle. It looked like his face was, sewn up tight. But really, there's lots of pictures of him laughing and smirking and just being jovial. So there's just so many photos of Coolidge. You can go through photos forever and see whatever you want to see. He was highly photographed for sure, and he did like it. Don't listen to people who say he didn't like it. He did like it. And another thing for Tom here, the story about the woman who bet that he could get him to speak more than 2 words, that is a false story, according to Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was introduced at a press meeting with that story about how the woman could bet that he can speak more than 2 words, and he said, "You lose." Calvin, after that story of introduction was presented, he got up and he said, "That story is a perfect example of all the false rumors that go around Washington so readily," or something like that. So he personally discounted that story. There's many other good ones, though, that are true.
That's a shame, because I thought that story was great. I actually thought, wow,
it was a good one.
I want that story to be said about me.
Yeah, we have to kind of drop that story as official. It's Calvin didn't think it was not true.
He was such a strange standard bearer to have for, like, I mean, you think of the Roaring Twenties and the wild times and so on that were taking place. And what is the Roaring Twenties per se? Could you give me an idea? Is that from like the mid-20s to the crash? When is that period really?
Well, the roar probably starts in like 22, 23. I'm not sure. It starts under the Harding era, and it's cultural as well as economic. It's across the board, and so Harding represented that very well. And I really, like I said earlier, I do believe Coolidge was a conscious thought to balance that kind of wild spirit with something more sober, because the whole country wasn't roaring in the 20s. It was mostly confined to the cities. The roaring in the rural places, it was prohibition being ignored, was pretty much the roar of the rural zones. So, and of course, you had women's suffrage as part of that. More just women in the workplace, not relying on marriages for their well-being. So there's all sorts of things connected to it, but it starts probably 22, 23, and obviously ends with the crash in 29.
It's the cultural feel of that you have the notion of the country like cutting loose, and it's at the same time, it's almost like the balancing act of having him as this quiet, just very sober, almost taciturn guy,
yes,
as the standard bearer for the country at that time. And it's just the opposites attract, I guess.
It's a juxtaposition that we don't see very often in our history, and he is still representing, though, most of the country, I think, at that time. It's still in that rural to urban transition. It's in full flight at that point, but there's still this, like, as we go more urban, we're yearning for rural, and so there's this yearn back to this old simple style. And having been to the Vermont town meetings personally not that long ago, about 10, 15 years ago, there are really unique experience in democracy. And I really do believe Calvin was so influenced as a kid by that he had full belief that the people will figure it out. He saw Democrats going at it with Republicans, figuring local issues out because they had to. Things like flood control. I mean, we just saw flooding in Vermont not long ago. They were dealing with that 100 years ago, but they had to get beyond politics. And he kept seeing examples of that. So I really think he was, like, as strong as a Republican as he was, I do think in many ways he was beyond politics, which makes him unique, a politician who's beyond politics. He didn't pander. He wasn't gullible. He didn't fall victim to tricks and falsehoods. He took stands that were often quiet but firm. And his biggest criticism, one of the biggest criticisms I've come across is his dealings with African Americans. And it's a mixed bag for sure. There's one speech in particular he gives at Howard University, a mostly Black university in DC. And when I read a reference about it, from one side, this is from the Coolidge Foundation information, they seem to use that as an example of his racial understanding and his tolerance, which we heard some about earlier, and his hope for continued progress. It's a very positive speech. But when I read further, it shows a lot of uninformed kind of hopefulness or even ignorance on the subject. And he comes up with this really weird angle about slavery that I've never heard anyone mention. A friend of mine just this morning said that a Republican recently said something similar to this in Congress, which isn't that surprising. But his speech to the people at Howard that day was along the lines of that slavery was part of the master plan, and it was a good thing because it preserved the blacks in this country for future greatness, as opposed to if we hadn't captured them in their homeland and brought them here, they would have just been wasted in their homeland. They never would have amounted to anything or some such thing. And he repeats this argument during the speech, and I'm just going, really? I've never heard that argument, that slavery benefited blacks in the long run because it got them here where they had to wait 400 years. But I don't know. It just seems like a person who had very few dealings with African Americans in his life and was looking at them as a voting bloc, but also as humans. He was strongly opposed to lynching, but as president, stepping on states' rights at that point wasn't quite as easy as it seems to his critics.
I'm sure that's what the Southern plantation owners had in mind too, was future black greatness when they were.
I'm sure that was it. That was
had them working. That was their intention all along, but they just did a very good job of hiding their intentions.
Yeah, very good. Now, if you look at an electoral map of the 24 election too, you'll see it's one of the sharpest divided lines I've ever seen on an electoral map. The Southeast is carved out for the Democrats, and that's it. Other than Wisconsin going to Follette, that's it. Every other state goes for Coolidge. So it's a landslide for sure.
It's strange because, you hear him talking about the public good and it's the roaring 20s and it's economy and business and such. And he had one of his ads that I saw that you showed there was for a full dinner pail. And it's like, but for who? I mean, you had over 60% of the people were living below the substance levels in the midst of this incredible boom in the country. And I just can't picture how, when you have these people in the White House meeting and talking, that no one's saying, listen, I know the progressives like a La Follette would of course have been championing the people. But when you have over 60% of the people having trouble putting food on the table or keeping a roof over their head, I mean, wasn't there any move even among the conservative base to say, listen, is there some way that we could try to have this boom affect these people as well? Do we have a distinct problem here when approaching 2/3 of the population is living in this substandard condition? How is it they didn't see a problem there? Or did they just have the sense, unlike us now, that's the way of the world? It's almost like a social Darwinism.
Yeah, that's a really tough one to approach. I think it is similar to today in that people really didn't feel they had many choices other than what was given to them. You had a lot more third party and fourth party activism back then, a lot more effective local third and fourth party activism back then, because you didn't have rules on the books that mandated X amount of signatures by a certain date to get on the ballot. It was much more free and open to have anybody come up outside of the party controls and be a player and be a broker, even if not a winner in a race. So the one movement I think you see connected to what Coolidge was doing, particularly in the agricultural sector, it's the rise of the Grange movement and the Farmer Alliance movement. Now, this goes back to the 1870s. It continues on through this period of the 1890s into the 19-teens and 20s. And it starts to lose effectiveness with the New Deal because it's less needed when the New Deal comes along. But I think I look at, if there's any group that stood out in solidarity and more of an alliance. It's the farmer movement, more so than even the labor movement. And of course, the farmer movement by this time is a shrinking number. They're not a big power player anymore electorally, but locally, we still see farmer labor party members in Congress, in mayor positions, in state legislatures, all over the Midwest. The Midwest, especially states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, they were rife with third and fourth party effective movements that actually took controls and made changes for their own benefit. But again, the inner city people, the poverty stricken folks who are just struggling in their day labor work, they're often too overwhelmed to be activist in anything other than survival. And I think they would just pick the party that was offering the most bling or the most goods at that time, or perhaps even the most drinks on that day of voting. I mean, it could come down to that as far as controlling blocks of the poorer sector votes. But again, there is a gap there between the 20s that we hear about and the reality. And again, the reality connected to prohibition is that you had the growth of organized crime. You had a growth of disregarding law. One of Coolidge's more interesting philosophies is that he's often perplexed why the focus isn't on observation of law rather than enforcement of law. He was not a law enforcement guy. He was a law observation guy. Like, let's observe the law, whether we like it or not, because it's the law. It was a constitutional, Bible type thing where, it doesn't matter good or bad. That's what it says. We have to follow that for our own good. And again, he does make a fair argument that once the prohibition law became ignored continuously, it undermines other law by federal government trying to control this or that. Well, people are saying, well, they tried to force that prohibition on us. Why should we listen to this? And it's kind of the beginning of that era. So I think we see elements of all aspects of life, and it's just a matter of what gets focused on. And the history books often overlook that 60% living below the poverty line.
You always hear how laissez-faire policies are always presented as this idea of it's great for business and it creates a great foundation for the future. But if you look at it actually in practice, like laissez-faire policies in the 20s, and then you're followed by the Great Depression, laissez-faire policies under Reagan in the 80s, and then you end up with a serious recession and the complete collapse of the savings and loan industry in this country. Mm-hmm. Laissez-faire policies under George Bush in the 2000s, and then with the complete meltdown in 2008. It's like a party for a wealthy few, and then a headache and a hangover for the rest of us. It just creates a boom and a bust. So I don't understand. People still sit there, oh no, we need that laissez-faire, but it always ends up with the same thing. It's just that driving us off a cliff.
That's a very strong point. And to add to that, I have my own analogy about laissez-faire politics. My own analogy is that allowing a hands-off policy, allowing businessmen to make the laws for businesses that they control, is like saying that you want to start a chicken company and you want to raise a lot of chickens. And so to do this effectively, I'm going to hire a fox to run the chicken house because foxes know chickens. And that may be partially true, but the problem is foxes only know how to eat chickens. They don't know how to grow chicken. And so when they eat all the chickens, they just want more chickens because they don't know how to grow them. And that's where this endless cycle comes in my way. Oh, it was DeSantis. Okay, good. Thank you for that. Okay, thank you. I heard that this morning and I didn't have a name put to it, but it was Ron. Okay, that's about right. So anyway, yes, I do feel that laissez-faire is it works when you have honest, non-greedy people, perhaps. But unfortunately, with business, it doesn't usually go that way. And here's the problem with regulation now, okay? Because I'm looking at these early days of government intervention with Follette and with FDR and even with Wilson. And the early interventionist government policies are predicated on honest people being kind of part of the mix, honest public servants being part of the mix. And I think that tended to be the case early on, even into the Roosevelt years. And then I think as power corrupts, I think we have a rise of a government class that's basically no longer independent and public servant minded. They're basically of the business class, and they just get shifted over to the government class. And now you have regulators who are part of the business regulating for their own benefits. And that's where we lose our government oversight. And certainly Reagan was fantastically effective at that, for appointing cabinet members who are against their cabinet. Trump, every cabinet member was openly against that particular part of the cabinet or that the function of that position. So we see how things get easily undermined when we're thinking of a government oversight that's for the greater good of everyone, and instead it's a government oversight that's simply insider trading type deals. And that's where the difference is to me. I don't know if it's all that different from years ago, but there's just less of the public servant available and more of the greedy person that are making themselves available for these positions. I just see that as a simple math problem.
It ends up being like putting lunatics in charge of the asylum, but it's like you don't even realize they're lunatics until they get in charge of the asylum, and then they go insane.
Yes. Very good.
I love to do this. I love to put you on the spot, big brother. I'm putting you on the spot. I'm going to ask, because I bring it on. He says, sometimes I'll just ask him a random question. Do you know that Coolidge loved, he loved animals, right?
Yes.
You know this? He was given a gift, a special gift. Do you know what that gift was?
Are you talking about Rebecca the raccoon?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not talking about
Rebecca.
Yeah,
you know Rebecca, right? Rebecca was given to the Coolidges for a Thanksgiving dinner. Like they thought they should cook it up instead of a turkey. I don't know why. And then, of course, they didn't eat the raccoon. And instead, they got Rebecca a partner named Roscoe. So they became raccoon breeders in the White House, but that didn't work out either. So they had to ship them off to a zoo. But what's the special gift you're talking about?
Apparently, Coolidge, when he was president, he received a gift from the mayor of Johannesburg.
Oh.
Yeah. So I did stump him. See, I can't even stump him because I try to stump him, but then he tells me about Rebecca the raccoon. So it's not really a stump because he's offered up but he was apparently, Coolidge was given a gift of 2 lion cubs.
Wow.
President of Johannesburg. And he
Guess what?
What?
Guess what, Michelle?
What?
I guarantee they came through the quarantine station at Clifton, New Jersey. Guaranteed.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Yeah, we go there all the time. The Clifton Cultural Center.
That's right. That's right.
Wow. Maybe there's a picture of them. But he had 2 unique names for these cubs. I love that I know something that my brother doesn't. I just Googled it. But these cubs were named Budget Bureau. Budget Bureau and Tax Reduction.
He was a comedian. I'm telling you, he was the Bob Newhart of presidents. I'm sticking with that. I am not budging on that.
I love it.
Yep.
And
yep. The button down world of Calvin Coolidge. There you go.
Wow. He had a collie named Rob Roy.
Rob Roy, definitely, yes. A very faithful companion. Yes,
yep.
yes.
And you know the worst part of that story about the lion cubs? Do you know what happened to them? He ended up having it for Thanksgiving dinner. That's what I mean. I don't know what the story was on that guy. It's really strange.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much, Chuck. We're going to end here because we have to get another Zoom room open for our book club. But we have another. Really, we're just going to end this sort of series for now. next month on, what did I say it was, the 18th of the first day of
18th.
middle classes. It'll be in the afternoon. We'll bump the time back to 3 o'clock on the 18th, and it is on Herbert Hoover. So that should be a fascinating, because Herbert gets blamed for everything.
He gets blamed, interestingly, and when you look at Hoover in the Coolidge years, he's the progressive. He's the liberal. He's the one doing all sorts of government things that have never been done before, and yet he's the one blamed for not doing enough.
Yeah.
Well, he's carrying the baggage for the previous 8 years for the laissez-faire for 8 years.
That
So
is
he ends
correct.
up.
That is correct.
So, we'll learn about Hoover on the 18th of September at 3 o'clock. And Chuck, once again, always fascinating, always great, and we could spend all day. We could watch you. You could have your own channel, for God's sake.
We could. I could.
You guys, thanks to our audience and for your participation. And what?
Chuck, are you going to stop after Hoover, or are you going to approach it a different way? Then
We're going to continue on. I think we're not going to miss any months, but we're going to change to a slightly different format on the subject matter. I'm working on some things now on what I'd like to cover. We're trying to keep a theme of like how we can tie in history to current events, whether it's Supreme Court things or whether it's the one of my favorite topics lately has been the capping of the House of Representatives at 435. Why we have still 435 House members for a population that's grown incredibly since the 130 million. We're at 330 million now. We capped it when we were at 130. That means we're way underrepresented in our House of Representatives. And I'm fascinated by that process. And that's just an example of what I'm going to be looking into.
Yeah, so we're going to take a little bit of a break, and we're going to stop on Hoover for a bit, and we're going to just delve off, kind of veer off the road into some other topics. And also the current climate, and knowledge is power, and I think we all feel better when we know more. And I think Chuck is a great example of really knowing the history of our country, and understanding it gives us a better understanding of what's happening today. And so being able to
and I think an important aspect of that I wanted to just mention briefly is it's a philosophy of studying history that's people focused. I'm really trying to become as people focused as I can, less on events and more on people, because when we talk about people, we can relate, we can understand flaws and challenges and kind of hidden things that don't get focused on. Focusing on events can be more difficult because there's more opinions, there's more people, let them tell the story is really the best way to do it. Find the people, get their story out, and let them tell it.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear you talk about FDR, though. I would really love to see a dig into him too. But that would be something where we could continue for the rest of the year on everything involved.
And it could be a whole series just on that. But we're going to veer off a little bit, give Chuck time to work on some other stuff, and pick the rest of those blueberries. Get them all fine, Chuck. All right.
We'll follow Michelle back to Kazakhstan.
Thanks everybody.
Again to everybody. Appreciate it.
That was great, Joe. Thanks, Michelle.
Bye-bye.